6 weeks after what the media called the stand of the Wanderer captain, Alex Morgan stood in the United Nations Assembly Hall and addressed representatives from 47 human nations and delegates from 32 alien civilizations, and the Wanderer sat in a specialized orbital dock where Viridian and human engineers worked side by side to repair the damaged quantum fold drive, and Morgan wanted to make something very clear to everyone listening. Morgan explained that they had not won because they were better fighters, but because they had changed what winning meant, and the Kaldrith delegation sat in uncomfortable silence, and they had arrived 3 days earlier, not with demands of surrender, but with proposals for diplomatic negotiations, and Admiral Vorn was not among them, because he had been recalled to the Kaldrith homeworld to explain how a single human vessel had triggered the largest coordinated resistance movement in galactic history. The captain continued and said the Kaldrith came expecting a military victory, and they brought dreadnoughts and weapons and centuries of experience conquering worlds, and Earth could not match any of that, so they did not try, and instead they fought. A different battle entirely, and on the screen behind Morgan footage played of the Wanderer's impossible dance through the alien fleet, mixed with images of dozens of ships that had arrived to stand with Earth. Helen Price sat in the audience next to President Linda Hayes, and she was the physicist whose theories had made the quantum fold drive possible, and she whispered to the president asking if the Kaldrith would actually agree to the terms, and the president nodded slowly and said they did not have much choice, because 17 worlds had already declared independence and more were moving in that direction every day, and the Kaldrith had built their empire on fear, and humanity had broken that fear. The terms that Earth proposed with support from the newly formed coalition of free worlds were straightforward and clear, and they called for a phased withdrawal of Kaldrith occupation forces from all conquered territories and the establishment of neutral zones for species seeking independence, and most importantly, the acknowledgement that military superiority did not grant the right to subjugate other civilizations. And this last point was the foundation that would reshape galactic politics. The lead Kaldrith negotiator was an elder named Koth, and he finally stood to speak, and his voice carried the weight of a civilization coming to terms with the end of an era. And he said the Kaldrith Empire had existed for 700 standard years, and in that time they believed their technological advancement and military power gave them not just the ability to conquer, but the right to rule, and he admitted that humanity had shown them the flaw in that belief. Koth paused, and though his alien features were hard for humans to read, his tone seemed to carry something that might have been respect, and he said that a single ship with no weapons had defeated an armada, not by destroying it, but by making its destruction meaningless, and the humans proved that power without legitimacy was just force, and force alone could not hold an empire together when people decided they had enough. Morgan nodded and admitted they were not entirely sure the plan would work, and a ripple of laughter moved through the assembly as tension broke slightly, and Jake Sullivan sat with the rest of the Wanderer crew in a special section, and he had received a commendation for his impossible navigation during the battle, and Carrie Walsh leaned over and whispered that she still could not believe they were alive and not dead. Jake admitted he had calculated their chances of survival at about 5% when they launched, and it turned out that being too stubborn to die actually counted for something, and the negotiations continued for another 3 hours as they hammered out details that would reshape how civilizations interacted for generations to come, and the Kaldrith agreed to withdraw from 14 systems immediately, with more to follow as transitional governments could be established. They retained control of their core territories but acknowledged the sovereignty of species seeking independence, and more importantly, they agreed to join the new Interstellar Council, where disputes would be resolved through negotiation rather than force, and the Council's founding charter included a clause that came to be known as the Morgan Principle, and it stated simply that the ability to destroy was not the same as the right to rule. 3 months later, the Wanderer completed repairs and prepared for her original mission, which was deep space exploration, and the crew had become celebrities across dozens of worlds, but they were eager to return to their actual work. And Captain Morgan stood on the observation deck looking out at Earth hanging in space like a blue jewel, and the planet had changed in the past months. Humanity had gone from believing they were alone and vulnerable to discovering they were part of a larger galactic community, and their stubborn refusal to accept the impossible had inspired that community to stand together and Lisa Grant joined Morgan at the viewport and asked if the captain was nervous about heading back out into space, and Morgan admitted to feeling a little nervous. The captain explained that last time they launched they expected to map distant nebulas and study alien ecosystems, but instead they ended up starting a revolution, and Lisa asked if Morgan thought they would face something that dangerous again, and the captain smiled and said probably not, because the universe could not throw anything at them crazier than being 12 explorers in a small ship facing down an invasion fleet. Lisa laughed and said that knowing humanity's luck, they would probably discover something even more impossible, and somehow figure out how to make it work. And the Wanderer departed Earth orbit a week later, heading for the Andromeda Relay with a new mission to establish first contact with civilizations beyond the known sectors. But the ship carried something more important than just crew and equipment. The vessel carried a message that had already begun spreading across the galaxy, and that message said impossible was just the starting point for humanity. And back on Earth, a memorial was erected at United Nations headquarters, and it bore the names of the Wanderer crew and a simple inscription in multiple languages, both human and alien. The inscription said that on this day 12 explorers refused to surrender, and the galaxy learned that freedom could not be taken from those unwilling to give it up. And they sent dreadnoughts, but humanity sent determination, and that made all the difference, and people from all over Earth came to see the memorial and remember what had happened. Admiral Vorn retired from military service and lived quietly on the Kaldrith homeworld, and he kept a small hollow image on his desk that showed the Wanderer dancing through his fleet, and visitors sometimes asked why he kept a reminder of his greatest failure, and he always gave the same answer. He said it reminded him that strength was not the same as power, and power was not the same as right, and the humans taught him that lesson, and he kept the image so he would never forget it. And across the galaxy, on worlds that had been conquered and were now free, parents told their children the story of 12 humans who refused to bow. The details varied from culture to culture and from species to species, but the core message remained the same, and it said that when the strong threaten the weak, and when the mighty demand submission, and when the impossible seems certain, people should remember the Wanderer, and remember that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate choices. And the story reminded everyone that sometimes, against all logic and all expectation, 12 stubborn humans in a ship held together by hope and determination could change the entire galaxy, and they did it not through strength of arms, but through the strength of an idea that refused to die, and that idea was simple but powerful. The idea said that freedom mattered and dignity mattered, and no species, no matter how powerful, had the right to take those things away, and the Kaldrith sent their dreadnoughts, which were the most powerful weapons in their arsenal, and humanity sent a single ship and proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon was the simple refusal to surrender. The galaxy would never be quite the same again, because now everyone knew that resistance was possible, and that even the smallest and weakest could stand against the mighty if they had courage and determination and the willingness to try when everyone else said it was impossible. And that lesson spread from world to world and changed everything. Children across hundreds of planets grew up hearing the story and learning that they did not have to accept injustice just because someone stronger said they must. And the legacy of the Wanderer and her crew of 12 became a foundation for a new era in galactic civilization, where right mattered more than might and where freedom was recognized as something worth fighting for no matter the odds. The sky above Earth changed in an instant when 17 massive alien ships appeared near the moon, and each vessel was so large that it could block out the sun if it came close enough to the planet, and the ships were dark and covered with weapons that looked like they could destroy entire cities with a single shot, and nobody on Earth had ever seen anything like them before, and the sight filled every person who looked up with a deep sense of fear that they had never known. Admiral Vorn stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the small blue planet below him with eyes that showed no mercy, and he had conquered 47 worlds before this one, and each time it had been the same, and the aliens would arrive in their massive ships and demand surrender, and if the people refused, then one of their cities would be destroyed as an example, and after that everyone always surrendered, because they understood that fighting was useless, and Vorn expected this time to be no different from all the others. The people of Earth saw the alien ships on every screen and every device, and panic spread across the world as fast as lightning, and governments tried to keep order, but everyone could see that there was nothing they could do against ships that big and that powerful, and the United Nations called an emergency meeting, and all the leaders of the world gathered to discuss what could be done. But deep down, they all knew the answer was nothing. President Linda Hayes sat in the White House and looked at the faces on the video screens around her, and she could see the fear in every eye. And General Paul Rodriguez was the head of Earth Defense Force, and he told everyone the truth that nobody wanted to hear, and he said that their weapons were useless against the alien ships, and even their most powerful nuclear bombs would not even scratch the surface of those massive vessels, and the technology the aliens used was hundreds of years ahead of anything humans had ever built. Then the aliens sent a message that appeared on every screen in every language, and Admiral Vorn's face looked down at all of humanity, and his voice was cold when he spoke, and he said that humans had 6 hours to surrender completely, and if they refused, then the aliens would destroy one of Earth's major cities to show what would happen to those who did not obey. And the message ended and left everyone staring at empty screens, wondering if this was the end of human freedom. The leaders talked and argued, but there was no good answer, and some said they should surrender to save lives, and others said they should fight even if it meant death. But nobody had a real plan that could work against 17 ships that could destroy the planet, and the clock kept ticking, and the 6 hours kept getting shorter and shorter. But there was something the aliens did not know about, and it was a secret that only a few people in the world knew existed. And deep on the dark side of the moon, there was a hidden base. And in that base there was a ship called the Wanderer, and it was the first ship that humans had ever built that could travel faster than light. And it was not a warship, and it was not designed for fighting, and it was made for exploring distant stars and studying new worlds, and the crew was only 12 people, and they were scientists and engineers and explorers who had never been in combat. Captain Alex Morgan was sitting alone in the small cockpit of the Wanderer when the call came through, and it was President Hayes herself, and Morgan listened as the president explained what she wanted, and the plan sounded completely insane, and Earth would send one small ship with no weapons against 17 massive alien warships, and Morgan asked why they would do something so impossible, and the president said, because it was all they had, and because sometimes the universe needed to learn that humans do not give up even when there is no hope. Morgan looked back through the ship at the crew, and there was Jake Sullivan, who handled navigation, and Carrie Walsh, who kept the engines running, and Danny Price, who managed communications, and Lisa Grant, who was the medical officer. And there were 8 others, and all of them were good at their jobs, but none of them were soldiers, and none of them had ever fired a weapon in anger. And they were peaceful people who wanted to explore the stars, and now they were being asked to face an invasion. Fleet alone. Morgan made the decision and told the president that they would do it, and within 2 hours, the Wanderer launched from the hidden base and accelerated toward the alien fleet and back on Earth. People watched their screens in shock as news reporters tried to explain why humanity was sending one tiny ship against 17 dreadnoughts, and many people thought their leaders had gone mad, and others thought it was a suicide mission, and some people prayed while others just watched in silent horror. Admiral Vorn saw the small Earth ship approaching on his sensors, and he laughed because it seemed like a joke, and he could not understand why the humans would send one vessel that was smaller than his flagship's shuttle bay, and he thought perhaps they were trying to surrender in person, or maybe they wanted to negotiate, but either way it did not matter, because the outcome would be the same as it always was. But then something happened that Vorn did not expect, and the small ship did not slow down as it got closer, and it did not send a message asking to surrender, and instead, it broadcast something in the Kaldrith language that made Vorn stop laughing, and the message was simple and clear, and it said that the aliens wanted to see what humanity could do, and that they should watch closely because they were about to learn something new. The Wanderer came closer and closer to the alien fleet, and Vorn prepared to destroy it with a single shot. But then the impossible happened, and the small Earth ship simply vanished from all sensors, and it did not explode, and it did not run away, and it just disappeared completely as if it had never been there at all. And 3 seconds later it reappeared in the middle of the alien formation, right between the massive dreadnoughts where their weapons could not fire without hitting each other. On the bridge of the Wanderer, the crew held their breath, and Morgan smiled even though their hearts were pounding with fear. And Jake Sullivan had guided them through the first jump perfectly, and now they were inside the enemy formation, and the real test was about to begin. And Morgan spoke calmly to the crew and said that Phase 1 was complete, and now it was time to show the aliens why underestimating humanity was always a mistake. The tactical officer's voice carried genuine fear, And that was something Admiral Vorn had rarely heard from his disciplined crew. And the officer reported that new contacts were emerging from hyperspace, and there were multiple signatures, and it was the Viridian Commonwealth fleet with 23 warships, and they were positioning themselves between the Kaldrith Armada and Earth. And Vorn could not understand what was happening, because the Viridians had surrendered 30 years ago, without firing a single shot. A new voice filled the communication channels, and it spoke in the clicking language of the Viridian species. And the voice belonged to Fleet Commander Xena, and she announced that the Viridian Commonwealth had been monitoring the attack on Earth, and she demanded that the Kaldrith Armada stand down immediately, or face engagement, and the threat was clear. Even though everyone knew the Viridian fleet was older and less powerful than the Kaldrith Dreadnoughts. On the Wanderer, the exhausted crew stared at their tactical displays in complete disbelief, and the dying ship's sensors showed the new arrivals, and the vessels looked old and less advanced than the alien dreadnoughts, but there were enough of them to matter. And Danny Price reported that they were receiving a communication from the Viridian flagship, and his voice shook with emotion as he read the message. The Viridians said they had heard the broadcast from the Wanderer, and they said if humans could resist with one ship, then the Viridians could resist with the fleet they had been secretly rebuilding for 3 decades. And Morgan slumped back in the command chair, and suddenly felt how tired they all were, and asked Jake about the drive status, and Jake reported that it was completely dead, and they were running only on conventional thrusters, and if anyone shot at them now there would be no escape. But Admiral Vorn was not thinking about the Wanderer anymore, because his tactical situation had become far more complicated, and the Viridian fleet alone was not enough to defeat 17 Kaldrith dreadnoughts, but engaging them would result in casualties and delay, and more importantly, it would signal to every other conquered world that rebellion was actually possible, and that was something the Empire could not afford. Then more contacts appeared on the sensors, and the Harmon Collective arrived with 12 warships, and they had been subjugated 42 years ago, but now they were here, and broadcasting their defiance. And then the Thelos Union came with 18 ships, and the Mirians arrived with 7, and none of these fleets alone could challenge the Kaldrith. But together they represented something the Empire had never faced before, and that something was coordinated rebellion on Earth. President Linda Hayes watched the tactical displays with tears streaming down her face, and she said they came. And they actually came, and General Paul Rodriguez stood beside her and nodded slowly, and explained that Morgan's broadcast had not just reached other governments but had reached people and conquered populations who had been living under Kaldrith rule for decades, heard a crew of 12 humans refusing to surrender, and it reminded them that they could refuse too. More ships kept arriving, and not all of them were military vessels, and some were retrofitted cargo haulers, and others were civilian transports that had been hastily equipped with whatever weapons their crews could mount, and they came from dozens of different species and represented worlds that the Kaldrith had crushed under superior firepower. And they all shared one thing in common, and that was, they had listened to Morgan's broadcast and decided that today was the day they stopped accepting oppression as inevitable. Admiral Vorn found himself facing a decision he had never expected to make, and he could still destroy Earth because the combined fleet surrounding his armada was formidable, but not overwhelming, and the Kaldrith would take casualties and perhaps serious ones, but they would ultimately win through superior technology and training. And there was no doubt about that outcome. But the question was, what would it cost? Every destroyed ship would represent another species learning that the Kaldrith could be hurt, and every casualty his fleet suffered would prove that the supposedly invincible Empire could bleed, and the recordings would spread across the galaxy. And within months every conquered world would be in open revolt, and the Empire that had stood for 700 years might collapse because one human ship had shown everyone that resistance was possible. Vorn realized something he had never understood before in his long military career, and that realization was that superior firepower was not always the winning strategy, and sometimes the battle was not about who had the bigger guns, but about who controlled the story that people believed, and the Kaldrith had always controlled that story by making everyone believe they were invincible, but Captain Morgan and the crew of the Wanderer had shattered that belief. The Admiral opened a channel to his fleet and ordered all ships to power down weapons and maintain defensive posture but not to engage. And then he switched to a direct channel to the Wanderer and broadcast to all the assembled vessels simultaneously. and his voice was different now and less certain than it had been at the start of this encounter. Vorn addressed Captain Morgan directly and acknowledged the message that had been sent and said that this matter required further consideration, and the Kaldrith Armada would withdraw to a neutral position while they consulted with High Command. And it was not a surrender, but it was not a victory either. And it was something new and unexpected, and it was a pause that gave everyone time to think. Morgan could barely process what was happening, and exhaustion made everything feel distant and unreal. But the captain managed to respond and said they would be here if the aliens wanted to talk instead of shoot. And as the Kaldrith Dreadnoughts began moving away from Earth, the assembled fleet of unlikely allies maintained their positions around the planet like a protective shield. Carrie Walsh worked frantically to keep the ship's life support functioning, because the quantum drive was dead and power systems were failing, and they did not have much time left before even breathing would become difficult. And Danny reported that the Viridian flagship was offering to take them aboard, and they said the Wanderer crew deserved medical attention and a hot meal at minimum, and that they owed humanity more than could ever be repaid. Morgan looked around at the crew and saw the same exhausted pride in every face. And they had been 12 explorers sent on an impossible mission with no weapons and no backup plan, except to be so stubborn that the galaxy could not look away, and somehow that had been enough, and the captain told Danny to accept the Viridian offer and to send one more message thanking them for remembering that freedom was worth fighting for. The message went out across all channels and was received by dozens of species who had thought themselves too weak to resist. But resistance, as humanity had just proven, was not about strength, but about the willingness to try even when the odds were impossible, and especially when the odds were impossible, because that was when trying mattered most. The Viridian ship sent a shuttle to retrieve the Wanderer crew, and as they prepared to transfer over, Morgan took one last look at the battered ship that had carried them through the impossible, and the vessel had held together through forces it was never designed to withstand, and it had performed miracles because its crew refused to give up. And now it floated dead in space, but its mission was complete. Jake Sullivan was the last to leave the bridge, and he patted the console gently and whispered thanks to the ship that had kept them alive. And then he followed the others to the airlock where the Viridian shuttle was waiting. And as they crossed from one ship to another, they left behind the Wanderer. But they carried with them something far more important, and that something was proof that courage and determination could change the galaxy. The quantum full drive let out a sound like metal screaming, and Carrie Walsh's hands flew across her engineering controls as she tried to keep the machine from tearing itself apart, and she rerouted power and bypassed damaged circuits and did everything she could think of. But the truth was simple and unavoidable, and she called up to the captain and told Morgan that they had maybe 5 more jumps left before the whole system would explode. And after that they would be flying on conventional thrusters against 17 ships that could vaporize them with a single shot. Morgan studied the tactical display and saw the alien dreadnoughts repositioning and learning from their failures and adapting their formation to close off the spaces where the Wanderer could maneuver. And the aliens were getting smarter with each passing minute, and soon there would be no safe place left to jump to. And Morgan knew that when the drive died, they would become an easy target. And Danny Price reported from communications that 43 civilizations were receiving their broadcast, and the number was growing as some of them rebroadcasted the signal to others, and Morgan nodded because this was exactly what they had been counting on. Morgan activated the ship-wide intercom and spoke to the entire crew, and told them that in a few minutes they would not be able to jump anymore, and when that happened, they would become a conventional target, and the alien dreadnoughts would destroy them. But before that happened, they were going to deliver a message that would echo across this entire sector of space. And everyone on the crew knew what that meant, and they knew they were probably going to die, but they also knew that their deaths would mean something. On the bridge of the Eternal Conquest, Admiral Vorn received an urgent communication from Kaldrith High Command, and the message had been sent days ago from their homeworld 600 light-years away. But it had just arrived, and the content made Vorn feel cold inside. And his superiors were asking about the status of the Earth conquest, and they said they were receiving intelligence reports that other civilizations were watching the situation with unusual interest, and they ordered Vorn to complete his mission immediately and eliminate any resistance, and Vorn understood what they were really saying. The Kaldrith Empire's power had always rested on one thing, and that thing was the perception that they were invincible. And every conquered world told stories of overwhelming force, crushing helpless victims, and those stories kept the Empire strong, because nobody wanted to be the next victim. But this small human ship was broadcasting a different story to the entire galaxy, and that story said that the Kaldrith could be beaten, and if that story spread, then the entire Empire might crumble. Vorn gave orders to all his ships and told them to target the Earth vessel with everything they had, and he said to use concentrated plasma fire on the next jump emergence point, and to use predictive algorithms, and he did not care if they had to burn out every weapon system they had. But that ship had to be destroyed immediately, and all 17 dreadnoughts powered up their weapons to maximum and prepared to fire everything at once. The Wanderer materialized between two dreadnoughts, and instantly the space around it erupted in hell as plasma bolts and kinetic projectiles filled every inch of space, and Jake Sullivan's reflexes saved them one last time as he initiated an emergency. Jump half a second before impact and they reappeared near Earth's moon. And Morgan knew this was their final chance because the drive was done, and warning lights painted the cockpit red, and somewhere deep in the ship, metal was groaning under stress, that it could not survive much longer. Danny opened a channel on all frequencies, and Morgan told him to make sure every ship in the alien fleet could hear this, and to make sure every civilization monitoring the situation would record it. And as the Kaldrith fleet turned toward their position with weapons charging for a final overwhelming barrage, Morgan began speaking, and the words came from the heart, because there was no time left for anything else. Morgan said that the ship was dying and the crew would probably not survive the next few minutes, but before the aliens destroyed them, there was something they wanted everyone to know, and Morgan wanted the Kaldrith to hear it, and wanted every listening civilization to record it and remember it, and the message was simple but powerful, and it was the truth that humanity had learned over thousands of years of history. Morgan explained that Earth had not sent one ship, because it was all they could afford to lose, but because they wanted the aliens to understand something fundamental about humanity. And humans were not warriors by nature, but were explorers and scientists and artists and dreamers, and the crew of the Wanderer was not made up of soldiers but researchers who had trained to study distant stars and not to fight battles. And this was important because it made what they were doing even more significant. On the Eternal Conquest, Admiral Vorn listened despite himself, and his weapons continued charging, but something made him want to hear what the human captain had to say, and maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was respect for an enemy who had fought so well with so little. But whatever the reason, Vorn did not give the order to fire just yet. Morgan continued and said that when someone threatens your home and demands that you surrender your freedom and tries to make you bow to superior force, then humans become something more than what they were before, and they become the most stubborn and creative and dangerous species anyone would ever encounter, and not because they were strong, but because they refused to accept that strength should determine what was right. The captain explained that the aliens had come with 17 dreadnoughts because they thought overwhelming force would make humans submit, and they had conquered 47 other worlds this way. But Earth was not like those other worlds, and humans had looked at the impossible advantage and decided that impossible just meant nobody had done it yet. And one ship had evaded an entire fleet, not because humans were superhuman, but because they were stubborn humans who refused to play by rules designed to make them lose. Morgan paused and looked around at the crew, and every one of them nodded because they knew what came next, and they were ready for it. And they had always known this mission might be one way, but they had chosen to come anyway because some things were worth dying for, and Lisa Grant gripped her medical station and Jake held the controls steady, even though they had nowhere left to jump, and Carrie kept the dying engines running through pure determination. The message continued, and Morgan addressed every civilization that was listening, and said that the Kaldrith wanted everyone to believe resistance was futile, and they wanted people to see their massive ships and accept subjugation as inevitable. But humanity had shown what could be done with just one exploration vessel and a crew of 12. And if humans could do this, then imagine what others could do if they stopped believing the alien story and started writing their own. Then Morgan spoke directly to the Kaldrith and said, they could destroy this ship and kill this crew, but they could not undo what had been proven. And the galaxy now knew the aliens could be beaten, and they were not invincible, but just bullies. With big ships and every civilization the Kaldrith had conquered, and every world they had threatened was watching this broadcast and realizing the same thing that humanity had realized. Morgan smiled even though death was only seconds away and said that sometimes the strongest weapon was not force but the refusal to surrender. And humanity did not bow because humans adapted and overcame and never stopped fighting, and those were the final words as Admiral Vorn raised his hand to give the firing command. Then something happened that nobody had expected, and it came from a direction that changed everything. And Vorn's tactical officer suddenly reported new contacts emerging from hyperspace, and there were multiple signatures. And it was the Viridian Commonwealth fleet, and they had 23 warships, and they were positioning themselves between the Kaldreth and Earth. And Vorn's eyes went wide because the Viridians had been conquered 30 years ago and had submitted without resistance, and their fleet had been decommissioned under Kaldreth supervision. But apparently that decommissioning had not been as complete as the Kaldreth had believed. The alien bridge erupted in chaos and confusion as sensor operators tried to track the small Earth ship that kept appearing and disappearing like a ghost, and Admiral Vorn slammed his hand against the command console because nothing like this had ever happened in all his years of conquest, and his science officer named Thex studied the readings with wide eyes and told the Admiral that the humans were folding space itself, and they were not using normal engines at all, and instead, they were making tiny jumps through hyperspace over and over again so fast that the computers could not predict where they would be next. The Wanderer moved through the alien formation like water flowing between rocks, and it would appear in one spot for just a few seconds and then vanish before any weapons could lock onto it, and then it would appear somewhere completely different. And Jake Sullivan's hands moved across the controls with practiced skill, even though sweat was running down his face and he knew that one mistake would mean instant death for all of them. But somehow he kept the ship moving and kept them alive. Down in the engine room, Carrie Walsh watched the quantum fold drive with growing worry, and the machine was getting hotter and hotter with each jump, and it was not designed to work this way, and she called up to the captain and told Morgan that they could keep jumping for maybe 20 minutes before the whole system would explode and kill them all, and Morgan's voice came back calm and steady, and said that 20 minutes should be enough time for what they needed to do. Danny Price activated the communication system and began broadcasting a message that would be sent to every major civilization in this part of the galaxy. And it was a gamble, but it was the only real weapon that humanity had, and the weapon was not missiles or lasers, but information. And the message told everyone who was listening that Earth was not a warrior planet, and that humans did not have weapons aimed at the stars, and that they did not have a fleet of warships, but they did have something the aliens had not expected, and that something was the refusal to give up even when winning seemed impossible. Admiral Vorn received reports from all his other ships, and every captain was telling him the same thing. And the small Earth vessel was making fools of them all, and every time they powered up their weapons to fire, the ship would just disappear and appear somewhere else, and twice the Dreadnoughts had almost shot each other by accident because the human ship kept jumping into positions where firing was dangerous, and Vorn felt something he had not felt in a very long time. And that feeling was frustration mixed with a tiny bit of fear. Vorn ordered his fleet to deploy fusion mines, and thousands of small explosive devices shot out from launch tubes across all 17 ships, and they spread out in a cloud of death, and each mine had sensors that would detect anything that came close, and each one had enough power to vaporize the small human ship instantly. And there were so many mines that it seemed impossible for anything to get through them without being destroyed. On the Wanderer, the crew watched their screens fill with red warning indicators, and Lisa Grant spoke from the medical bay and said what everyone was thinking. And she said there was no way through that many mines, and there were just too many of them, and the space between the alien ships was now filled with thousands of floating bombs that would explode if the Wanderer came anywhere near them. But Morgan had been thinking about this possibility, and had talked to Carrie about it before they launched, and Morgan gave the order to push the fold drive to maximum power, and told Jake to plot jumps at intervals of just 0.2 of a second, and they were going to do something that the aliens thought was completely impossible. And Carrie protested and said that jumping that fast would burn out the drive in less than a minute. But Morgan said they just needed to make it count, and gave the order to execute the plan. What happened next would be studied by alien civilizations for decades to come, and the Wanderer began jumping so fast that it looked like it existed in multiple places at the same time, and to anyone watching from outside, it appeared that the small ship was skipping across space like a stone skipping across water, and it moved through the minefield without ever staying in one place long enough for the proximity sensors to detect it. and the technique was based on old theories about quantum mechanics and the idea that if something moved fast enough, it became hard to pin down exactly where it was. The aliens watched in disbelief as the human ship seemed to phase through their minefield, like it was not even there, and every mine that tried to lock onto the ship found nothing, because by the time the sensor detected something, the Wanderer was already gone and somewhere else, and the ship emerged on the far side of the minefield with all its systems screaming warnings about imminent failure. But they had done it, and they had proven that the impossible was just another challenge to overcome. Inside, the Wanderer alarms were blaring and the quantum fold drive was making sounds that no machine should ever make, and Carrie was routing power from every non-essential system just to keep the engine from exploding, and she shouted to the captain that they maybe had 5 more jumps left before everything went critical, and after that they would be flying on regular thrusters against 17 ships that could destroy them with one shot. Morgan looked at the tactical display and saw that the alien dreadnoughts were repositioning and learning from their mistakes and adapting their formation to limit the spaces where the Wanderer could jump to, and the aliens were smart, and they were figuring out the patterns, and soon there would be nowhere left to hide, and Morgan knew that the next few minutes would determine everything. Danny's communications board lit up with incoming signals, and he reported that 43 different civilizations were receiving their broadcast, and many of them were rebroadcasting it to others, and the message was spreading across the galaxy, faster than anyone had expected, and Morgan knew this was good because that had been the plan all along, and the plan was not to defeat the aliens with weapons, but to defeat them with an idea, and that idea was that resistance was possible. All across the galaxy on worlds that had been conquered by the Kaldrith Empire, people were watching the broadcasts and seeing a single small ship from a primitive planet doing what their entire civilizations had been too afraid to try. And they were seeing that the mighty Kaldrith fleet could be outmaneuvered and embarrassed and made to look weak, and the seed of rebellion was being planted in millions of minds. Back on Earth, billions of people watched the live feeds with a mixture of terror and hope, and they saw their one small ship dodging and weaving through an entire invasion fleet, and they saw that it was still flying and still fighting and still refusing to give up, and for the first time since the aliens arrived, people began to think that maybe humanity had a chance and maybe surrender was not the only option. Admiral Vorn stared at his displays and felt something he rarely experienced, and that feeling was uncertainty, and this situation was not following any of the patterns he had learned in 700 years of Kaldrith conquest, and these humans were supposed to be primitive and weak and easy to frighten, but instead they were proving to be something far more dangerous. And that dangerous thing was unpredictability. And Vorn realized that an enemy you could not predict was harder to defeat than an enemy with superior weapons.